There is a photograph sitting in an archive that almost nobody asks about anymore. It isn't famous. It isn't displayed in museums very often. Most people who see it scroll past within seconds. At first glance, there's nothing remarkable about it. Just a boy standing beside the entrance of a cotton mill. His clothes are worn. His face is thin. One hand rests awkwardly against his side as if he isn't quite sure what to do while the camera is pointed at him. But then you read the note written beneath the photograph. The boy was 10 years old, and according to the record attached to the image, he had already been working there for years. Not months, years. The photograph was taken by a man named Louis Hine. And what happened after he met that boy would eventually help expose a reality that millions of Americans had never truly seen. But the strange part is this. When Louis first spotted him, he wasn't looking for a child. He was looking for a lie. Because by the time this story begins, Louis had already heard the same claim dozens of times. Factory owners said children rarely worked in their mills. Managers insisted the reports were exaggerated. Newspapers repeated official statements. Everything was supposedly under control. Yet everywhere Louis traveled, he kept hearing whispers that suggested something very different. And one autumn morning, those whispers led him to a mill town where something wasn't adding up. The town looked prosperous enough. Brick buildings lined the streets. Smoke drifted from tall chimneys. Storefronts opened for business. Workers moved through the morning darkness carrying lunch pails and canvas bags. From a distance, it looked like a place built on opportunity. But Louis had learned that distance could be deceptive. The closer he got to industrial America, the more complicated the picture became. And on this particular morning, one detail caught his attention immediately. The children. There were too many of them. Some walked with parents. Others traveled in small groups. A few appeared completely alone. They moved toward the factory gates long before most schools would have opened their doors. Louis checked his watch. The sun was barely rising, yet the children kept coming, one after another. He stood quietly near the road and watched. A girl who couldn't have been older than 12. A boy carrying a metal lunch container nearly half his size. Another child rubbing sleep from his eyes as he hurried to keep pace with older workers. No one seemed surprised. No one stopped to stare. No one asked why children were heading toward a factory before sunrise. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. To the town, this was normal. And whenever something becomes normal, people stop questioning it. Before we go further, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. These forgotten stories seem to travel all over the world, and it's always fascinating to see where they find people. And if you enjoy uncovering the hidden lives behind history, consider subscribing. There are many more stories waiting to be remembered. Louis waited near the entrance as workers passed through the gates. Then he noticed the boy, the same boy who would later appear in that photograph. At first, there was nothing unusual about him. In fact, that was exactly the point. He looked ordinary, the kind of child you might pass on a sidewalk without a second glance. But Louis had spent enough time around factories to notice small things. The boy's hands, the way he walked, the tiredness in his face. This wasn't his first day. This wasn't temporary work. This was routine. The boy approached the gate, nodded briefly to another worker, and disappeared inside the mill. Louis watched him go. Something about the scene bothered him, not because it was shocking, because it wasn't. The child moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there, as though years of factory work had become as normal to him as school was to other children. Hours later, when workers began emerging from the building, Louis saw the boy again. This time he approached him. The conversation started simply. A name, a few questions, nothing unusual. The boy answered politely. Then Louis asked how old he was. The answer came quickly. 12. Louis looked at him carefully. The number didn't seem right. The child looked younger, much younger. It wasn't proof, just a feeling. But Louis had learned to trust those feelings, so he continued talking. Little by little, details began appearing. The boy mentioned things without realizing their significance. How long he'd been helping, how long he'd been around the machinery, how long he'd been earning money. Louis did the math in his head, and suddenly the story changed. If the boy's own timeline was accurate, he could not possibly be 12. The numbers didn't fit. Someone was wrong. Either the child was mistaken, or someone had changed the facts, and that raised a question Louis couldn't ignore. If one child's age had been adjusted on paper, how many others had been adjusted too? At that moment, he had no idea where the question would lead. He didn't know it would pull him into a battle involving factory owners, government investigators, newspapers, and some of the most powerful industrial interests in the country. He didn't know that years later historians would still be studying the photographs he was about to take. All he knew was that a boy standing outside a mill seemed younger than he claimed to be. A small detail, easy to overlook. But history often begins with details that seem too small to matter. And over the next few days, Louis would discover that this boy was not an exception. He was the beginning of a pattern that stretched across towns, industries, and entire states. A pattern that somebody was working very hard to keep invisible. And the deeper Louis looked, the stranger the story became. The next morning, Louis returned before sunrise. He wanted to see the workers arrive again, not the managers, not the company representatives, the workers, because people often reveal more before a workday begins than during one. The streets were still dark when he arrived. A cold wind moved between the buildings. The factory itself loomed over the town like a giant shadow. Its windows glowed faintly against the morning sky, and once again workers began appearing from every direction. Men, women, teenagers, children. Louis recognized the boy immediately. This time he was walking beside an older woman. His mother, as Louis would later learn. Neither of them spoke much. They moved quickly, focused on reaching the mill before the shift started. But something caught Louis's attention. The woman looked exhausted, not the kind of tiredness that disappears after a night's sleep. The kind that settles into a person after years of struggle. As they approached the gate, the boy said something that made her smile, just for a moment. Then both disappeared into the building. That brief exchange stayed with Louis, because it reminded him of something important. These weren't statistics. They were families, and families rarely fit neatly into public debates. Later that afternoon, Louis managed to speak with the boy again. This time the child seemed more comfortable. The conversation flowed naturally. The boy talked about work, about home, about helping his family. Then Louis asked a simple question. "What would you rather be doing?" The boy hesitated. For the first time he seemed unsure. His eyes drifted toward the road, toward a group of children walking home from school. Then he shrugged. "I don't know." The answer struck Louis harder than he expected. Not because it was sad, because it was honest. The boy wasn't dreaming about becoming rich. He wasn't talking about adventure. He wasn't imagining distant possibilities. He simply didn't know. Work had occupied so much of his life that imagining something different felt almost impossible. That night, Louis sat in a small boarding house room reviewing his notes. The more he looked at them, the more one detail bothered him. The ages. Again and again, children claimed to be older than they appeared, sometimes by a year, sometimes by several. The pattern repeated too often to be coincidence. And then Louis remembered something a former worker had told him months earlier. Certain factories relied on age records provided by families, records that were not always carefully verified. In some places, birth certificates barely existed. In others, documentation was inconsistent. A child could become older on paper remarkably easily. The realization raised troubling questions. If ages could change on documents, what else could change? The following day, Louis decided to stay near the mill longer than usual, and that decision led to something he never forgot. Shortly after noon, a sudden commotion erupted near one of the side entrances. Workers rushed toward a gathering crowd. Voices rose, machines slowed. For several minutes, nobody seemed willing to explain what had happened. Lewis couldn't see clearly from where he stood, but eventually a worker emerged carrying a young girl in his arms. She was conscious, but frightened. One arm hung awkwardly against her side. The crowd parted as they moved past. Within minutes she was gone. The factory resumed operations. The noise returned, and the day continued as though nothing had happened. Yet nobody looked surprised. That was the detail Lewis couldn't shake. The workers looked concerned, but not shocked, as though accidents were simply another part of life, another risk people accepted because they had no choice. Later, Lewis asked questions. Most people answered cautiously. Some refused entirely. Others glanced around before speaking. Eventually, one worker offered a quiet explanation. The girl had been injured while working near machinery. Nothing unusual, he said. Nothing unusual. Those words stayed with Lewis long after the conversation ended. Because if an injured child could be described as nothing unusual, something was deeply wrong. That evening he reviewed his notes again. The boy, the mother, the age discrepancies, the injured girl, each detail seemed small on its own. Together they formed a picture, and that picture looked very different from the one factory owners described publicly. But Lewis still lacked proof, evidence strong enough to challenge official narratives. Photographs helped, stories helped, yet he needed something more, something undeniable. The opportunity arrived sooner than he expected. A few days later, while speaking with workers outside the mill, Lewis overheard two men discussing an upcoming inspection. At first he paid little attention. Inspections happened regularly. Then he heard something strange. One worker laughed, the other shook his head, and one of them quietly said, "Funny how the children always disappear on inspection days." Lewis looked up immediately. The men noticed his attention and stopped talking. The conversation ended, but the damage was done. A single sentence had changed everything. Children always disappear on inspection days. If that was true, then someone knew exactly what inspectors were looking for, and someone was making sure they didn't find it. For the first time, Lewis felt he was getting close to something much larger than a few factories hiring young workers. He was getting close to a system designed to hide what was happening, and if that system existed, exposing it would be far more difficult and far more dangerous than he had imagined. The question was no longer whether children were working. The question was who was helping keep it secret, and Lewis was about to find out. That single sentence followed Lewis for days. Funny how the children always disappear on inspection days. The worker had said it casually, almost as a joke, but the more Lewis thought about it, the less amusing it became. Because jokes often hide truths people are uncomfortable saying directly. And if factories really were hiding children whenever inspectors arrived, then somebody had to be organizing it. The question was who. A week later, Lewis returned to the same town. This time he wasn't interested in the factory floor. He was interested in timing, patterns, small details. The kinds of things people overlook when they're focused on larger problems. For 2 mornings he watched workers enter the mill. The same faces appeared, the same children, the same routines. Then, on the 3rd day, something changed. The atmosphere felt different. Supervisors moved through the property unusually early. Messages seemed to pass from person to person. Workers whispered. Managers appeared more frequently than normal. And most importantly, many of the children were missing. Not all of them, but enough. Enough for Lewis to notice immediately. The boy he'd been following wasn't there. Neither was the young girl who usually arrived with her older sister. Several others had vanished too. Lewis didn't need anyone to explain what was happening. He knew. The inspection had arrived. Suddenly the worker's comment made perfect sense. For months, perhaps years, factories had learned how to prepare for scrutiny. Not by fixing problems, by temporarily removing them. It was a clever solution, at least on the surface. But it created a new opportunity. Because if children disappeared before inspections, where did they go? That afternoon Lewis began asking questions, carefully, patiently. Most people refused to answer. Some genuinely didn't know. Others clearly knew more than they were willing to say. Then, near sunset, an older worker finally offered a clue. He pointed toward a cluster of buildings several blocks away. Storage sheds, warehouses, small workshops, nothing remarkable, at least not from the outside. "They usually keep busy somewhere else," the worker said quietly. Then he walked away. Lewis stared toward the buildings. His curiosity immediately shifted there. The next morning he arrived before sunrise. Instead of waiting near the factory gate, he positioned himself near the warehouses. And what he saw confirmed his suspicions. Children, lots of them, not entering the mill, entering the smaller buildings. Some carried tools, others carried supplies. A few simply waited. Hours passed. The official inspection continued elsewhere. The children remained hidden. It wasn't sophisticated. It didn't need to be. The goal wasn't to solve the problem. The goal was to move it out of sight. That discovery angered Lewis more than he expected. Not because it was shocking, because it was deliberate. Someone had looked at the issue, understood it, and chosen concealment over change. That choice revealed something important. The people running these operations knew exactly how their actions would appear if exposed publicly, which meant they understood the problem better than anyone. And yet they continued. Lewis began documenting everything: times, locations, names, conversations, photographs. The evidence pile grew larger each day. But then something happened that nearly ended his investigation altogether. Late one afternoon, while photographing workers near a factory entrance, Lewis noticed two men watching him. At first he ignored them. People watched him constantly. Most were simply curious. These men were different. They weren't curious. They were evaluating him. The feeling lingered. And when Lewis packed his equipment and started walking back toward town, the men followed. Not closely, just enough to be noticed. Block after block, street after street, always there, always behind him. Lewis didn't panic, but he paid attention. Eventually he stepped into a crowded restaurant. The men remained outside, waiting. When he emerged nearly an hour later, they were gone. The message had been delivered. Someone knew who he was, someone knew what he was doing, and someone wanted him to know they were paying attention. That night, sitting alone in his room, Lewis faced a decision. He could leave. Many people would have. The photographs already taken were significant. The stories already collected mattered. No one would blame him for moving on. But then he thought about the boy, the one whose age didn't seem right, the one who had shrugged when asked what he wanted to do with his future. Lewis realized something. The child had no ability to leave. Neither did thousands of others. If he walked away now, they would remain exactly where they were, invisible. And perhaps that was what bothered him most. Not the factories, not the managers, not even the deception. The invisibility. Because once people become invisible, almost anything can happen to them, and nobody asks questions. The next morning, Lewis returned to work, more determined than before. What he didn't realize was that his photographs were already beginning to travel beyond the towns where they were taken. Editors were seeing them. Advocates were discussing them. Organizations were requesting copies. The images were starting to reach people who had never stepped inside a factory. And among all those photographs, one image was about to attract more attention than any other. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. It showed no accident, no injury, no catastrophe, just a small girl standing alone in front of a mill. Yet within a few years, that photograph would become one of the most recognized images in America. And when people learned her age, everything changed. The photograph looked almost disappointingly ordinary. No smoke, no machinery, no dramatic scene unfolding in the background, just a young girl standing outside a textile mill. Her dress was simple. Her hair was neatly pulled back. She looked directly at the camera with a calm expression that revealed almost nothing. If someone passed the photograph quickly, they might never stop to examine it. But Lewis had learned something important about human nature. The photographs that stayed with people were rarely the loudest. They were the quietest. because quiet photographs force viewers to look longer. And the longer they looked, the more questions they asked. The girl's name was not widely known at the time. She was one of thousands of children working in mills across the country. To factory owners, she was part of the workforce. To most adults, she was easy to overlook. To Lewis, she represented something larger, a question, a mystery, a reality hidden in plain sight. When he first spoke to her, the conversation seemed unremarkable. She answered politely. She was respectful, reserved, the kind of child who appeared older than her years. Lewis asked how old she was. She gave an answer. Then he asked how long she had been working. And suddenly the numbers stopped making sense. The timeline didn't fit. Not perfectly. Not comfortably. The longer he talked to her, the more obvious it became that she had spent a significant part of her childhood inside the mill. That alone was striking. But what stayed with him wasn't her age. It was what she said next. When Lewis asked whether she liked the work, she didn't immediately answer. Instead, she glanced toward the factory building, toward the windows, toward the place where she would return the next morning. Then she quietly said something Lewis would write down later, not because the words were dramatic, because they weren't. The girl simply described work as normal, normal, the same word he kept encountering. Children called it normal. Parents called it normal. Supervisors called it normal. Entire towns called it normal. And Lewis began wondering whether normal was the most dangerous word in the country. Because once enough people accept something as normal, they stop asking whether it should be. The photograph was published alongside others. At first, it was just one image among many, but something unexpected happened. People remembered her. Letters began arriving. Organizations requested copies. Speakers used the photograph during public meetings. Viewers kept returning to it, not because she looked miserable, because she looked ordinary. She could have been anyone's daughter, anyone's granddaughter, anyone's neighbor. For the first time, many Americans stopped seeing child labor as an abstract issue. Now they saw a face, and faces are harder to ignore than statistics. Meanwhile, Lewis continued investigating, and what he discovered next was even more troubling. The problem wasn't limited to a few dishonest factories. It was bigger, much bigger. Records from different towns began revealing similar patterns. Children whose ages seemed inconsistent. Families who remembered events differently than official documents. Employment records that appeared strangely convenient. None of it proved a grand conspiracy. But together, the pieces suggested something else. An environment where accuracy was less important than productivity, and where asking too many questions was often discouraged. Then Lewis received information from a source he hadn't expected, a former supervisor. The man had left factory work years earlier. Unlike most people Lewis interviewed, he wasn't afraid to talk, perhaps because he no longer depended on the industry, perhaps because he had reached a point where silence felt heavier than honesty. Their conversation lasted hours, and during that conversation, Lewis heard something that changed the direction of his investigation. The former supervisor described how inspections were prepared for in advance, how warnings sometimes circulated, how records were organized, how certain workers disappeared temporarily. Much of it was difficult to verify immediately, but the account matched stories Lewis had already heard from multiple sources. Suddenly, separate clues began fitting together. The hidden children, the missing workers, the altered ages, the inspections, the warehouses. For months, Lewis had been collecting pieces of a puzzle. Now he was finally beginning to see the picture, and the picture revealed something important. The greatest threat to the system wasn't reformers. It wasn't politicians. It wasn't even investigators. The greatest threat was visibility. Because once enough people saw what was happening, defending it became far more difficult. That realization transformed Lewis's work. He stopped thinking of himself primarily as a photographer. He became something else, a witness, someone gathering evidence before it could disappear, someone preserving stories before they were forgotten. someone making sure ordinary people would not vanish from history without a record. The more photographs he took, the more resistance appeared. Factory managers became less cooperative. Questions went unanswered. Doors closed. And then one afternoon, a confrontation finally happened. Not a violent confrontation, something quieter, and in many ways more revealing. A factory official approached Lewis directly and asked a question. A simple question, but it revealed exactly why the photographs had become so dangerous. The man looked at Lewis and said, "Why are you trying so hard to show people things they don't need to see?" For a moment, neither man spoke, because hidden inside that question was the entire battle. Not whether the children existed, not whether the photographs were real, but whether ordinary Americans deserved to see them at all. And Lewis already knew his answer. The problem was that many powerful people had a very different one. And the conflict that followed would push his work into the national spotlight in a way neither side could fully control. The factory official's question stayed with Lewis long after the conversation ended. Why are you trying so hard to show people things they don't need to see? At first, it sounded like a criticism, but the more Lewis thought about it, the more it sounded like a confession. Because if people truly didn't need to see something, nobody would spend so much energy hiding it. The photographs were doing exactly what cameras are supposed to do. They were making invisible things visible. And that was becoming a problem for people who preferred certain realities remain unseen. Over the following months, resistance intensified. Managers refused interviews. Workers became nervous when questions were asked. Some towns welcomed Lewis. Others clearly wanted him gone. Yet the photographs continued spreading. And with every new image, more Americans found themselves confronting questions they had never considered before. One photograph showed a boy covered in cotton dust. Another showed children standing beside machinery that towered over them. A third captured a group of young workers leaving a factory after a long shift. None of the images shouted. None of them exaggerated. That was precisely what made them powerful. The photographs didn't tell viewers what to think. They simply removed the ability to pretend. Then something happened that Lewis hadn't anticipated. People began recognizing the children. Not famous people, ordinary people. A newspaper in one city published several photographs. Days later, letters arrived from readers. Some believed they recognized relatives. Others recognized former neighbors. One woman wrote that she thought she knew a girl appearing in one of the images. Whether she was correct hardly mattered. What mattered was the reaction. The children were no longer anonymous. They were becoming real. And once people start seeing individuals instead of statistics, public opinion can change surprisingly fast. But the most important development came from an unexpected source. The boy Lewis had first met outside the mill, the child whose age never quite seemed right. Months had passed since their initial conversations. Lewis assumed he might never see him again. Then one afternoon, while visiting another town, he received a message. A worker wanted to speak with him privately. The meeting took place after dark, far from the factory, far from supervisors, far from anyone likely to interrupt. The worker arrived cautiously. He checked the street before approaching. Then he handed Lewis a folded piece of paper. Nothing official, nothing dramatic, just a list of names. Beside many names were ages. Beside some ages were corrections. Children listed as 14, actually 12. Children listed as 13, actually 10. Children listed as old enough to work, actually far younger. Lewis stared at the page. For months he had suspected something like this. Now he finally held evidence suggesting the problem was larger than isolated mistakes. The worker explained quietly. People inside the factories talked. Workers noticed things. Families talked. Children talked. Everyone knew more than they admitted publicly. Then the worker mentioned something else. The boy Lewis had photographed. His age had been changed too, not by years, but enough. Enough to make employment appear acceptable. Enough to satisfy paperwork. Enough to make questions disappear. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Lewis looked down at the list again. The names felt heavier than the paper itself, because every correction represented a child. Every child represented a family, and every family represented a reality hidden behind official records. This was the midpoint Lewis had been moving toward all along. Not a dramatic revelation, a documented pattern. One child might be dismissed, 2 children might be explained away, but dozens, across multiple locations, that was something else entirely. And suddenly Lewis understood why some people were so determined to control the narrative. The issue wasn't simply child labor, it was visibility. Once the public saw enough evidence, maintaining the old story would become increasingly difficult. News of the photographs continued spreading. Organizations requested more copies. Public meetings grew larger. Journalists started asking harder questions. And for the first time, certain factory owners began responding publicly. Some defended their practices. Others attacked reformers. A few accused photographers and reporters of exaggeration. The debate was no longer happening in private. It had become national. Yet amid all the arguments, Lewis found himself thinking about something surprisingly simple. The children. Not the policies, not the speeches, not the headlines. The children. Because while adults argued, children continued showing up for work before sunrise. They continued spending long hours inside mills and factories. They continued living lives most Americans never saw. And that reality gave Lewis a renewed sense of urgency. The photographs mattered, but time mattered too. Every month that passed meant another month of childhood slipping away for thousands of young workers. That thought stayed with him as he packed his equipment for another journey. What he didn't realize was that his work was approaching its most influential phase. The photographs had attracted attention. Now they were about to attract something far more powerful: action. Because in cities far from the mills, lawmakers, investigators, reformers, and business leaders were beginning to fight over what should happen next. And for the first time, the outcome was no longer certain. The country had seen the evidence. Now it had to decide what to do with it. For years, Lewis Hine had been chasing evidence. Now, for the first time, the evidence was beginning to chase everyone else. The photographs were no longer sitting quietly in reports. They were appearing in newspapers, at public meetings, inside lecture halls, on display boards carried from city to city. People who had never stepped inside a cotton mill were suddenly staring into the faces of children who spent most of their lives there. And once they saw those faces, many found it difficult to forget them. The debate intensified. Factory owners defended themselves. Reformers pushed harder. Journalists published investigations. Politicians delivered speeches. Across the country, people argued about responsibility. But beneath all the public discussion, Lewis noticed something interesting. The conversation was changing. A few years earlier, many people had questioned whether child labor was really a significant problem. Now the question had become something else entirely. What should be done about it? That shift mattered, because before a society changes, it usually has to acknowledge what exists, and that acknowledgement was finally happening. Yet progress was far from guaranteed. Some industries fought back aggressively. Newspaper editorials criticized reform efforts. Business leaders warned of economic consequences. Certain politicians argued that government intervention would create more problems than it solved. The battle was no longer about photographs. It was about competing visions of America's future. And like most important battles, it became complicated very quickly. One evening, after a public presentation featuring several of his photographs, a man approached Lewis. He wasn't angry. He wasn't confrontational. If anything, he seemed thoughtful. The man studied one of the images for several moments before speaking. Then he pointed toward a photograph of a young worker. "Do you know what happened to him?" Lewis paused. It was a reasonable question, and one he couldn't always answer. The truth was that photographs captured moments. Lives continued afterward. Children grew older. Families moved. Jobs changed, stories scattered, many simply disappeared from the historical record. For the first time, Lewis realized something that unsettled him. He had spent years documenting childhood, but childhood doesn't last. The children in his photographs were becoming adults. What happened next? Did they escape the mills? Did they find better opportunities? Did they build the futures they dreamed about? Or did life carry them somewhere else entirely? The questions lingered, and in some cases, Lewis searched for answers. One story in particular stayed with him. The boy from the mill, the child whose age had never quite matched the paperwork. Months after their first meeting, Lewis learned something unexpected. The boy was no longer working there. At first, Lewis feared the worst: accident, illness, some tragedy hidden from public view. Instead, he discovered something far more hopeful. The boy had returned to school, not permanently, not easily. His family still struggled. Money was still scarce. Nothing about their lives had become simple. But for the first time in years, the child was spending part of his day in a classroom instead of beside machinery. To many people, it might have seemed like a small victory. To Lewis, it felt enormous, because suddenly the issue had a face, a name, a future. The debates in newspapers felt different now. The political arguments felt different. Everything felt different. Because behind every policy discussion stood real children whose lives could change depending on the decisions adults made. That realization spread far beyond Lewis. Across the country, public pressure continued building. Investigations expanded. New laws were proposed, some failed, others succeeded, court challenges emerged, industries resisted, progress moved slowly, painfully slowly, but it moved. And throughout it all, the photographs remained. Silent witnesses, evidence that could not easily be dismissed, evidence that forced people to confront realities they might otherwise ignore. Years later, many historians would point to legislation and legal battles when explaining how child labor declined. Those events certainly mattered, but historians also noticed something else. Before laws changed, minds changed. Before minds changed, awareness changed. And before awareness changed, people had to see. That was Lewis Hine's contribution. He made people see, not through speeches, not through arguments, through faces, through stories, through ordinary moments captured at exactly the right time. Yet there was something strangely ironic about his success. The more famous the photographs became, the less famous Lewis became. The images spread. The causes spread, the reforms spread, but the man carrying the camera gradually faded into the background. History often works that way. The people who preserve memory are not always remembered themselves, and as the years passed, another question quietly emerged. Not what Lewis had documented, but why he had devoted so much of his life to documenting it, because there were easier careers, safer careers, more profitable careers, yet he kept returning to the same places, the same communities, the same forgotten people. Why? The answer wasn't found in politics, or economics, or even photography. It was something much simpler, and understanding that answer may be the key to understanding why his story still matters more than a century later. Because Lewis Hine wasn't really trying to photograph factories. He was trying to preserve something far more fragile, something that disappears quickly when nobody pays attention. And in the final chapter of this story, that purpose becomes impossible to miss. There is something remarkable about old photographs. The longer you look at them, the less they seem like history, and the more they seem like memory. A century can pass, entire generations can come and go, cities can change, industries can disappear, buildings can be demolished, yet a single photograph can still make a stranger feel familiar. That was the strange gift Lewis Hine left behind. Not photographs, connections. When most people think about history, they think about presidents, wars, inventions, and famous names. But Lewis spent much of his life pointing his camera somewhere else, toward ordinary people, toward lives that rarely appeared in textbooks, toward children who were never supposed to become historical figures. And somehow, because he photographed them, they did. The boy outside the mill, the young girl standing alone in front of the factory, the children hurrying through the darkness before sunrise, most never became famous. Most never appeared in history books. Yet more than 100 years later, people still look into their faces. That matters, because history is often shaped by people who are remembered, but it is built by countless people who aren't. As Lewis grew older, America continued changing. Factories evolved, technology advanced, laws shifted. The industrial world he had documented slowly transformed, and many of the children he photographed grew into adults living entirely different lives. Some started families, some served their communities, some disappeared into the ordinary rhythm of American life. The historical record doesn't always tell us where they ended up, and perhaps that's fitting, because Lewis was never trying to create heroes. He was trying to make sure people weren't forgotten. There is a difference. The deeper historians studied his work, the more valuable it became. Researchers discovered details hidden inside the photographs: street signs, storefronts, factory equipment, neighborhoods, clothing. Small clues that preserved entire communities long after they were gone. What Lewis captured wasn't just child labor. He captured a world that would have faded almost completely without a visual record. And the more historians uncovered, the more they realized how much had survived because one man cared enough to pay attention. That may sound simple, but paying attention is rarer than we think. Most people walk past thousands of stories every day. Most disappear without a trace. Lewis stopped, looked closer, and asked questions that others often ignored. Who is this child? How old is he really? What happens inside that factory? Why is nobody talking about this? Who benefits from people not seeing it? Those questions transformed his work, but they also reveal something important about history itself. History doesn't only live in grand events. Sometimes it lives in overlooked details. A photograph, a notebook, a conversation, a face. The things most people consider insignificant often become the clues future generations treasure. And perhaps that is why Lewis Hines' story continues to resonate. Not because he solved every problem. He didn't. Not because he changed the country alone. He didn't. But because he proved something powerful. Visibility matters. People matter. Stories matter. The people society overlooks today may become the people future generations most want to understand. That lesson feels just as relevant now as it did more than a century ago. Because every generation has its invisible people. Every generation has lives hidden in plain sight. And every generation decides whether to look away or pay attention. Before we end, I want to thank you for spending this time exploring this forgotten chapter of history. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more stories like it, consider subscribing. Forgotten Echoes is dedicated to finding the people, moments, and memories that history nearly left behind. And I genuinely love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? It's one of my favorite parts of sharing these stories, seeing how far they travel, and discovering the people listening from around the world. Lewis Hines spent years preserving faces he knew he might never meet again. More than 100 years later, those faces are still speaking. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, patiently, waiting for someone to look. And perhaps that's the real legacy he left behind, not a collection of photographs. A reminder that every ordinary life contains a story worth remembering. And sometimes, the people history almost forgets are the ones who have the most to teach us. Until next time, thank you for listening. And thank you for helping keep these forgotten echoes alive.